Okay, so this is our second video for the week, and we're going to start into rules of exponents. So every video we have from this point forward, we'll talk about a particular rule that we use with exponents to help us simplify expressions. These are rules that that sometimes allow us to bypass certain steps of the order operations, kind of like we had with the distributive property with real numbers, where we could have two things inside parentheses being added, a multiply on the outside. Technically, order of operations say you have to deal with that addition first, but we learned that it's okay to multiply through, that even though that's out of order, it still works with real numbers. That's kind of how all these rules for exponents go. These are all different rules that work, even though they might feel like they're sort of out of order as far as order of operations go. Or the other thing that these rules will do is if we have multiple exponents dealing in the same problem, all of them happen in the same step. So this isn't an order of operations problem because all the exponents happen at the same time. What these rules will do is tell us if there's multiple exponents, how do we handle them when we get to the exponent step, okay? So that's kind of what all of the next several videos are going to be all about. However, what we're going to do is break from my normal pattern with these videos. Typically what I've been doing is making a video that kind of outlines the theorem or the rule or the theory, and then making another video with some examples. And the reason for that is because I don't want the videos to be too long. I want to build in some breaks. And so we spend a few minutes to make sure we understand the mathematics behind what we're doing. And then we spend a few minutes in another video actually doing it. These will be different because the theory and the mathematics behind these rules is really pretty short. So it'll only take a few minutes to talk about the theory, and then we'll do a couple of examples. And even with that all in one video, the video should still be very manageable. So with that said, let's get started by taking a look at our first rule. So our learning objectives for this is to know the product rule and use the product rule. That's the first rule we're going to use. Now, one final word of introduction to all of this. Remember when we talk about knowing things in our class, we don't want you to be able to word for word recite a definition or anything like that. What we need you to be able to do is have a working understanding. So really, these two learning objectives almost become the same thing. You need to be able to recognize when to use it. You need to use it. You need to know what to look for, that kind of a deal. So with that said, let's get into the product rule. Oh, I suppose it also goes hand in hand with that. If we don't need you to know an exact word for word definition, we also are not going to test you on the name. Certainly, we will use the name. I'll use the name. The name is something that you'll see in math books. It's a common name, but we're not going to put it on the test. What's the name of this rule or anything like that. Okay, so that was a lot of introduction, but that's going to be true for every video that follows. So now that that's out of the way, let's start focusing in just on the product rule. So here's what the product rule tells us. Let's start with actual numbers because everything's easier with actual numbers. If I have 2 raised to the 3rd power, and I multiply that by 2 raised to the 5th power. So this is where the name comes from. We have a product of 2 powers. That's why it's called the product rule. We have a product of 2 powers. 2 powers being multiplied together. Okay, now where does this rule come from? Well, let's take a look at what these literally mean for just a second. This means that I have multiplied together 3 2's. That's what that means. And this, 2 raised to the 5th power, means that I have multiplied together 5 2's. Okay, so what I've got in this situation is I've got 3 2's from the first thing, and I've got 5 more 2's from the second thing. So notice what I have all together: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 2's all together. So the product rule tells me that because of the way these lump together, I can just add the exponents. But of course, there's something that we need to realize. The reason I can add the exponent is because both of my bases were 2's. This gave me 3 2's. This gave me 5 2's. If this was not a 2, then I wouldn't be able to use my exponents at all. That wouldn't work. So what we have is a scenario. If our bases match and the powers are being multiplied, then we can add the exponents. And so that's what the product rule says. If the bases match and the powers are being multiplied, then we can add the exponents. Okay, now I say that we're starting with an example with numbers. I almost feel like in this particular case, that's a bad idea, because some of you are going to look at this and say, can I just type this into my calculator anyway? Why do I have to do all that? And you're 100% right. You could just type that in your calculator. And so maybe let's check it real fast because we can. Let's type in this first thing to my calculator. So parentheses 2, and remember for exponents, I'm using this caret button to get exponents. So 2 caret, that's hard to see, isn't it? Let me zoom in a little bit. That's a little bit better. 2 caret 3 parentheses. Oops. That's something else that I didn't mention in the previous video. When you make an exponent, to keep working, you have to use the side arrow to get your cursor out of the exponent. So to make that parentheses, I have to do the side arrow. So I've got parentheses, 2 caret 5 side arrow parentheses is the way I type that. And when I type that in, the answer I get is 256. If I just type in 2 caret 8, I get the exact same answer. So yes, it turns out that with this particular problem, I could have just typed that into my calculator. I didn't need to do any of that. So why would we have spent all that time? Well, because in math class, especially in algebra, we tend to have this nasty habit of doing things with numbers and then turning around and doing them again with variables. And variables, you cannot type into your calculator. Whoops, this should be an X, sorry about that. So I've got X to the 3rd times X to the 5th, okay? Now this I can type into my calculator. This I cannot, okay? As a side note, your calculator does not understand variables. You can try to type this in. Your calculator will even give you an answer if you type it in. 99.99% of the time, the answer your calculator will give you will be wrong, because your calculator thinks that it's smarter than it actually is, and it doesn't really know what to do with variables. It thinks it does, it takes a guess, it almost always gets it wrong, okay? So you cannot use variables on your calculator with the exception of graphing, and we're not gonna do that for a little while. But that's okay. If I wanna use this product rule, I could do this the exact same way I did this. This means I have 3 x's being multiplied together. This means I have 5 x's being multiplied together. And so all together, how many x's do I have? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I have 8 all together. And so what we end up with is x to the 3rd times x to the 5th is equal to x to the 8th, okay? Now, the point of the product rule is that you can go from this directly to this and skip that stuff in the middle, because it always works that way. That's what the product rule does. The product rule says if you have 2 powers multiplied together, then you can always just add the exponents to get the answer. Okay, so you don't have to show this work. Now, as a side note, every year we have a small group of students that they choose to do it this way every single time. That's 100% okay. You're not going to get points wrong for doing extra work. So if you're more comfortable doing this, by all means do it. But if you want a shortcut, then this definitely gives it to you. Okay, so with all of that said, let's take a look at 1 or 2 quick examples, and then we will be done with this particular problem. So let's suppose that I have a y raised to the 4th power times a y raised to the -2 power times a y raised to the 3rd power, okay? Now, in this case, we have not talked about negative exponents yet. You might know what that means from a previous math class. We're gonna talk about this in a video or 2 later from now, but at this point, we haven't talked about this. So to try and do this by converting it into something like this might be really, really hard for you right now, but that's okay, because the shortcut says, as long as you have powers multiplied together, which we do, here's a power times a power times a power, and as long as the bases match, which they do, y, they all match, then all you have to do is keep the base the same and add together the exponents. So a 4 plus -2, that becomes the same as 4 minus 2, so that's equal to 2. And then 2 plus 3 is equal to 5. And so my answer here becomes y to the 5th. And that's my answer. Okay, so that's the product rule. These are the types of problems that we're going to do with the product rule. You want to make sure you're comfortable with these types of problems. One last final little spoiler alert that will lead into stuff for other videos. There's a lot in this particular video that really applies to every video. So this is definitely going to be the longest video of all of our exponent rule videos, okay? One more thing that applies to all the other exponent rules. As we learn more rules, these problems are going to become more and more involved and complex and complicated because we're going to start mixing various different rules together within the same problem. So be aware of that. Right now, while there's only one rule, make sure you're comfortable with it. Make sure you know how to use it. Make sure that you can do this without any trouble, because in the next video, we're going to add a new rule, which means the problems are going to get a little bit more complicated because there'll be 2 rules mixed together instead of just one, like this video. All right, so thanks for watching. Make sure that you're comfortable with these and then move on to the next video.